The wind howled through the narrow alleyway, rattling the rusted dumpster and sending discarded newspapers fluttering down the pavement. The evening air carried the sharp scent of damp cardboard, rotting food, and something else, something sour and unpleasant. I pulled my coat tighter around me, hunching my shoulders against the cold, eager to get to my car after a long day at the clinic. Then, I heard it. A sound so faint I almost mistook it for the wind, a soft, whimpering cry. I stopped mid-step, listening carefully. The noise came again, a weak, broken sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned toward the dumpster, squinting into the dim light filtering from a flickering street lamp. Another whimper. My heart clenched. I knew that sound. It was the sound of an animal in distress, alone, hurting, and barely holding on. Stepping forward, I scanned the pile of garbage bags stacked against the metal bin. Something in my gut told me I wouldn't like what I found. I crouched down, carefully pulling one of the bags aside. The movement sent a fresh wave of foul air into my nostrils, but I hardly noticed. My focus was locked on a small, unmoving shape nestled between the trash bags. A dog. Or at least, what remained of one. He was curled up so tightly that, for a moment, he looked no different from the refuse surrounding him. His fur, once golden, was matted and dark with filth, clinging to his emaciated frame like a second skin. His ribs protruded beneath the grime, sharp enough that they seemed to stretch his fragile body to its limits. His eyes, those dull, sunken eyes, barely flickered open as I reached out a cautious hand. "Hey, buddy." My voice came out softer than I intended, almost a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would break him. He flinched at the sound, his frail body trembling against the cold. I swallowed the lump in my throat. How long had he been here? Days? Weeks? Had someone abandoned him, tossing him aside like yesterday's trash? The thought made my stomach twist. I removed my coat, slowly draping it over his fragile body. He was ice-cold beneath my touch, his breathing shallow. I had seen cases like this before. If I didn't act fast, I would lose him. But there was something in those tired eyes, a flicker of something that refused to die. He hadn't given up yet. And neither would I. I reached for my phone with one hand while gently slipping my arm beneath his frail body with the other. "Sarah, it's me," I said the moment my assistant picked up. "I need you to prep an exam room. I'm bringing in a rescue, and he's in bad shape. Tonight, this little soul wasn't going to be just another piece of discarded trash. Tonight, he was coming home." The weight of the frail dog in my arms was almost non-existent. He was far too light for his size, his bones pressing sharply against my hands as I cradled him against my chest. The cold air bit at my exposed arms where my coat had once been, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was getting him to safety. I hurried toward my car, moving as carefully as I could to avoid jostling him. Every so often, his body would twitch, and I could feel the weak rise and fall of his chest beneath my fingers. It was shallow, slow, too slow. I opened the passenger door and laid him gently on the seat, making sure the coat was still wrapped around him before I turned on the heat. The warm air filled the car, but he didn't react. Not a single movement, not even a flinch. I had seen many neglected animals in my years as a veterinarian, but something about this dog hit me harder than usual. Maybe it was the way his body had molded itself into the shape of the trash pile, as if he had accepted that he belonged there. Or maybe it was the silent resignation in his eyes, the kind that told me he had long since given up hoping for kindness. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before gently brushing my fingers against his head. His ears twitched slightly, but he didn't pull away. A small victory. "You're going to be okay?" I murmured, more for myself than for him. I put the car in drive and sped toward the clinic, my mind racing faster than my wheels on the empty road. I needed to assess his condition as soon as possible, check for broken bones, infections, internal injuries. But most importantly, I needed to get some fluids in him before his body shut down completely. As I pulled into the clinic parking lot, I saw the warm glow of lights spilling from the front windows. Sarah was already waiting at the entrance, a blanket in her hands, her expression tense with worry. "How bad is it?" she asked the moment I stepped out of the car. "Bad," I admitted. "Malnourished, weak, possibly infected. He was left in the trash, Sarah." Like garbage? Her face darkened. People can be cruel. Yes, I said, glancing down at the tiny, broken body in my arms. But we can be kind. We hurried inside, and I laid him on the examination table. Under the bright clinic lights, his condition was even more heartbreaking. His fur was matted with dirt, and patches of his skin were bare where old wounds had never healed properly. His paws were cracked and raw, and I could see the painful swelling around one of his front legs. Sarah inhaled sharply. "His worse than I expected." I nodded, my jaw tightening. "We need to start fluids immediately." I worked quickly, inserting an IV catheter into his foreleg, securing it with medical tape as Sarah prepared a saline drip. The first drops of fluid trickled into his tiny veins, but still, he barely reacted. "Come on, buddy," I whispered. "Stay with me." We checked his vitals. His heart rate was weak, his body temperature dangerously low. He had likely been without proper food or water for days, if not weeks. The infection in his leg needed immediate treatment, but his body was so frail that I had to be careful not to overwhelm him. Sarah gently lifted one of his ears and frowned. "He's got old scars. Looks like he's been in fights before." I clenched my fists. "Probably a stray. Maybe even used for fights. But that doesn't explain why he ended up in the trash." She sighed. "Some people don't see the value in a sick, starving dog. They'd rather throw him away than try to help." The thought made my stomach turn. I continued my examination, running my hands gently along his body, feeling for broken bones or internal injuries. His breathing was still weak, but he wasn't completely unresponsive. That was a good sign. He's dehydrated, but there's no sign of major fractures. The infection in his leg is my biggest concern right now. If we can get it under control and get some food in him, he has a chance. Sarah nodded. "I'll prepare antibiotics." I reached for a syringe filled with a light sedative, just enough to ease his pain as we cleaned his wounds. As I injected it, I watched his body relax slightly, his labored breathing slowing into something more even. "He's fighting," Sarah said softly. I exhaled. "Yes. But he's tired. He's been fighting alone for too long." As we worked, I kept stealing glances at his face, trying to imagine what his life had been before he ended up abandoned in that alley. Had he once had a home? A family? Or had he always been unwanted, unloved? I shook the thoughts away and focused on the present. We cleaned the infected wound on his leg, wrapping it carefully in fresh bandages. Then, using a syringe, I carefully dripped small amounts of nutrient-rich liquid into his mouth. His tongue barely moved to swallow, but at least he was taking something. "That's it," I murmured. "One step at a time." By the time we finished, the little dog was curled up in a soft bed in the clinic's recovery area, covered with a warm blanket. The IV was still delivering fluids into his system, and his breathing had stabilized, though he remained unconscious. I sat beside him for a long time, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. He had made it through the night. That was the first hurdle. The rest of his journey was just beginning. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor echoed in the quiet clinic room, each slow pulse a fragile sign of life. The little dog lay motionless on the soft bedding, his thin frame wrapped in a blanket, and IV drip feeding him the fluids he so desperately needed. He had survived the night, but that was just the beginning. His real battle was far from over. I sat on a small stool beside him, watching for any sign of movement. Every now and then, his breathing would hitch, his fragile body tensing as if trapped in some long-forgotten nightmare. I reached out, hesitating before placing a gentle hand on his bony head. "You're safe now," I murmured. He didn't react, but I liked to believe he could hear me, that somewhere deep in his unconscious state, he knew he was no longer alone. Sarah walked in, a clipboard in hand. "His vitals are still weak, but stable." "That's good news." I exhaled, rubbing my temples. "He's got a long road ahead." She nodded. "What's next?" I glanced at the IV, the slow drip feeding life back into him. "First, we let his body recover enough to handle food. We'll have to start small, broth, soft food. Anything solid would be too much for his stomach." Sarah jotted down notes. "And the infection?" I frowned. "It's bad, but we caught it in time. I'll keep him on antibiotics, but we need to be careful." His immune system is weak. If he doesn't start responding soon. I didn't finish my sentence. I didn't need to. Sarah understood. The next few hours passed in quiet vigilance. Every few minutes, I checked his breathing, adjusting his blanket when he shivered. When the sun finally began to rise, casting a golden glow through the clinic windows, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. He was still here. Still fighting. The first signs of life. By midday, there was the first sign of progress. A small, almost imperceptible twitch in his ear. It was the tiniest movement, but it was enough to make my heart skip. Sarah was by my side in an instant. "Did you see that?" I nodded, watching closely. Then, slowly, his eyes fluttered open. They were dull, tired, barely able to focus. But they were open. "Hey, buddy," I said softly, leaning in. "You're okay. You're safe." His nose twitched, his dry tongue barely visible as he attempted to lick his lips. Sarah quickly reached for the syringe of warmed broth we had prepared earlier. "Think he's ready?" "There's only one way to find out." I lifted his head slightly, supporting it as Sarah gently pressed a few drops of broth onto his tongue. For a moment, there was no reaction. Then, with a slow, almost hesitant movement, he swallowed. I let out a relieved chuckle. "There we go." Sarah smiled. "He's not giving up." I adjusted his blanket again, watching as his breathing steadied. It was a small step, but it was a step. Gaining trust. The next 24 hours were crucial. Every few hours, we fed him tiny amounts of broth and kept his fore running. He was weak, barely able to move, but his body was beginning to respond. By the second night, his eyes stayed open longer. By the third, he attempted to shift his position, letting out a faint whimper as he moved. On the fourth morning, something incredible happened. I was sitting beside him, absent-mindedly flipping through a veterinary journal, when I felt a tiny weight press against my foot. I looked down. He had moved. It was the first voluntary movement he had made. His frail body had shifted just enough so that his head rested against my shoe. My throat tightened. It was a small gesture, almost nothing, but to me, it was everything. Sarah walked in and saw it too. "Oh," she breathed, her expression softening. "He trusts you." I let out a slow exhale. "I think he's starting to." The first attempt to stand. The real test came a few days later. He had been getting stronger, eating small portions of soft food, his eyes more alert. His ribs were still visible, his movements slow and unsteady, but the light in his gaze had changed. He was no longer just surviving, he was fighting. And then, for the first time since his rescue, he tried to stand. I was kneeling beside him, gently stroking his fur, when he shifted. His front paws twitched, pressing against the soft bedding. His muscles trembled as he attempted to push himself up. I held my breath. He wobbled, his legs struggling under his own weight, and then, he collapsed. A frustrated whimper escaped his throat. I reached out, my voice calm and encouraging. "Hey, it's okay. You'll get there." Sarah, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward. "Maybe we should help him." I shook my head. "Not yet. Let him try." He tried again. This time, his paws held him for a second longer before he collapsed back onto the bed. His breathing was heavier now, exhaustion evident in every fiber of his being. But he had tried. That was what mattered. I ran a gentle hand over his head. "You're getting there, buddy. One step at a time." A name of his own. By the end of the week, he was standing on his own. Wobbly, slow, but standing. The transformation was happening before my eyes. The once lifeless dog I had pulled from the trash was now looking at me with something new in his eyes, determination. One evening, as I sat beside him, I found myself murmuring, "You need a name." Sarah, who had been tidying up supplies nearby, turned toward me. "You're keeping him?" I hesitated. I knew I couldn't. My job was to save them, to help them heal, and then find them a loving home. But the idea of letting him go made something in my chest tighten. "He's not ready yet," I said instead. "But he deserves a name." I looked at him, really looked at him. He was a fighter, strong despite everything he had been through. He had survived when the odds were against him. How about Charlie? I suggested. Sarah smiled. Charlie suits him. I reached down, running my fingers through his softening fur. Charlie it is. For the first time, his tail gave the smallest wag. And just like that, I knew Charlie was going to be okay. Charlie's journey from a weak, skeletal dog to a healthy, thriving companion would not happen overnight. His body had suffered the effects of starvation, his trust in humans had been shattered, and every step toward recovery would require patience, care, and an immense amount of love. But if there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that animals, especially those who had been through the worst, had a way of surprising you. The first small victories. The first few days were all about survival. His four stayed in place, delivering the nutrients and hydration his frail body desperately needed. Every few hours, Sarah or I would syringe feed him small amounts of broth or watered-down food, careful not to overwhelm his fragile digestive system. At first, Charlie remained passive, his dull eyes barely acknowledging our presence. He accepted the food, but there was no eagerness, no spark of life behind his gaze. Then, on the fifth day, something changed. It was a small moment, almost imperceptible, but one that made my chest tighten with hope. As I sat beside him, coaxing him to take a few more sips of broth, he did something he hadn't done before. He licked my fingers. It was quick, almost hesitant, but the intention was clear. He was beginning to trust. Sarah noticed it too. That's the first time he's shown any response, she said, her voice filled with quiet excitement. I nodded, feeling an unfamiliar warmth in my chest. He's still in there. He just needs time. And time was exactly what we would give him. Gaining strength, step by step. By the end of the first week, Charlie had made noticeable progress. He was eating soft food on his own, small portions at first, but his appetite was returning. His once sunken eyes were beginning to regain a glimmer of life. He even managed to hold himself upright for a few moments before his weakened legs gave out. It was slow, painstaking work, but every little milestone felt like a victory. One afternoon, while I was cleaning out his bedding, I heard Sarah gasp. I turned quickly, expecting the worst, but instead, I found her standing still, her eyes wide in shock. He wagged his tail, she whispered. I looked at Charlie, who was lying on his bed, staring at us. His tail had moved, just slightly, but it was enough to make my throat tighten. It was his first real expression of happiness. I knelt beside him, brushing my fingers lightly over his ear. You're getting there, buddy. Charlie looked at me, his gaze softer now. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that he was going to make it. Challenges along the way. Recovery was never a straight path. Just when things seemed to be improving, setbacks always found a way to creep in. One morning, as I arrived at the clinic, Sarah met me at the door, worry creasing her brow. He refused to eat this morning, she said. My stomach dropped. Charlie had been eating steadily for the past week, small meals, but enough to keep his strength up. A sudden refusal to eat was not a good sign. I rushed to his kennel, kneeling beside him. He was curled up tightly, his body tense, his breathing slightly more labored than before. I reached out to touch his head. He flinched. That reaction hit me harder than I expected. He had started trusting me, started seeking comfort in my touch. But now, something had shifted. Sarah crouched beside me. Maybe he's in pain? I nodded. Could be. His leg infection is healing, but it might still be causing him discomfort. We checked his temperature, slightly elevated. His wound wasn't as inflamed as before, but I could tell it was still bothering him. I sighed. I think we pushed him too fast. His body needs rest. For the next 2 days, we focused on pain management, adjusting his antibiotics and making sure he stayed hydrated. I spent extra time with him, simply sitting beside his bed, letting him know I was there. On the third day, I held out a piece of soft food. Charlie hesitated. Then, slowly, he licked it off my fingers. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That's my boy. It was another small step, but after every setback, even the smallest steps felt like miracles. Building trust again. Charlie's physical wounds were healing, but the scars left on his heart would take longer. He was still hesitant around new people, flinching at sudden movements, shrinking back if a hand reached out too quickly. His past had taught him that humans weren't to be trusted. I needed to show him otherwise. Every day, I sat with him, reading aloud, talking to him about nothing in particular. I made sure every interaction was gentle, every touch reassuring. One evening, as I sat cross-legged beside his bed, flipping through a book, I felt something warm press against my knee. I glanced down. Charlie had rested his head against me. I didn't move, barely even breathed. The moment felt too fragile, too precious to disturb. Then, slowly, I reached out and brushed my fingers along his head. He didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a deep sigh and closed his eyes. I swallowed hard, blinking back the emotion welling in my chest. That night, for the first time, Charlie slept without restlessly shifting in his bed. The first real walk. The day Charlie took his first real steps outside was one I would never forget. His legs had regained enough strength that he could stand on his own now, though he was still shaky. The real test was seeing if he could walk again, if he even wanted to. I clipped a light leash onto his collar and opened the clinic's back door, leading to a small enclosed yard. The fresh air hit us as we stepped outside, the sunlight casting a golden glow over the grass. Charlie hesitated at the threshold, his nose twitching as he sniffed the unfamiliar scents. I crouched beside him. "It's okay. Take your time." He looked at me, then at the open space ahead of him. Then, ever so slowly, he took a step. And another. And another. I watched, breathless, as he moved forward. His gait was unsteady, but he was walking, truly walking, for the first time since I had found him. Sarah stood beside me, wiping at her eyes. "He's going to be okay, isn't he?" I nodded, my own throat tight. "Yeah, I think he is." The moment I knew he was ready. Charlie's recovery continued, each day bringing new progress. He learned to wag his tail freely, to nuzzle my hand without fear. He started eating with enthusiasm, greeting Sarah with a small, hesitant lick when she arrived for her shift. But the moment I truly knew he was ready for a forever home came one afternoon, when a young boy named Ethan visited the clinic with his mother. Ethan had lost his dog a few months prior, and though he was still grieving, his mother believed he was ready to love again. Charlie was resting on his bed when Ethan walked in. The boy hesitated at first, his hands fidgeting nervously. I saw the way he glanced at Charlie, hopeful but cautious. Charlie, however, made the first move. Slowly, he stood up and walked toward Ethan, his tail wagging ever so slightly. Then, to my complete surprise, he nudged the boy's hand with his nose. Ethan's face lit up. He knelt, running his fingers gently over Charlie's head. "Hey, buddy." Charlie licked his hand. Ethan laughed, a sound so pure and joyful that it filled the entire room. And at that moment, I knew. Charlie had found his person. His journey had been long, filled with pain, setbacks, and uncertainty. But now, he had a home, a family, and a future filled with love. As I watched him walk out the door with Ethan, his tail wagging freely, I smiled. Charlie wasn't just a rescue anymore. He was finally home. Charlie had come so far. From the frail, lifeless creature I had found in the trash to a dog who could walk again, who wagged his tail, who leaned into my touch without fear. He had been through the worst, and yet, somehow, he had made it. Or so I thought. The road to recovery was never a straight path, and just when I allowed myself to believe that he was past the worst, an unexpected challenge emerged, one that threatened to undo everything we had worked for. One morning, I arrived at the clinic, expecting to see Charlie waiting at the door of his kennel as he had been doing for the past few days. He had developed a routine. When he heard my footsteps, he would sit up, his tail thumping softly against the floor, watching as I approached with his breakfast. But that morning, he didn't move. He was curled up tightly, his head resting on his front paws, his ears flat against his head. His breathing was steady, but something felt off. I crouched beside him. "Charlie?" "Nothing." I reached out, running my fingers gently over his head. His eyes flickered open, but they were dull, unfocused. He didn't flinch or pull away, but neither did he react the way he usually did. A slow, sinking feeling settled in my chest. Sarah, who had just arrived, stepped into the room and immediately noticed my concern. "What's wrong?" I shook my head. "I don't know. He's not himself today." She frowned and knelt beside me, reaching for the bowl of food we had prepared. "Maybe he's just tired?" But when she placed the food in front of him, he didn't even sniff at it. That was when I knew something was seriously wrong. Charlie, the dog who had fought so hard to survive, was giving up. Desperate measures. I ran every test I could think of, checked his temperature, his hydration levels, his vitals. Everything was stable. Nothing explained why he had suddenly withdrawn, why his body language had shifted so drastically. I went over every possibility. Was he sick? Was there an underlying condition we had missed? Or was this something else entirely? Sarah crossed her arms, watching Charlie with a troubled expression. "You don't think it's emotional, do you?" I glanced at her. "What do you mean?" She hesitated before answering. "Maybe he's scared again. Like, maybe he still doesn't trust that this is real." The thought hit me hard. Had we been so focused on healing his body that we had overlooked the scars still embedded in his heart? Charlie had been abandoned once, thrown away like garbage. What if, deep down, he believed that it could happen again? That everything we had given him, warmth, food, safety, was temporary? If that was the case, then no amount of medicine could fix him. He needed something else. He needed to believe that he was safe. Rebuilding what was lost. I sat beside Charlie's bed, watching him carefully. If he was shutting down because of fear, then I had to remind him, show him, that this was real, that I wasn't going anywhere. So I did the only thing I could do. I stayed. For hours, I sat next to him, not touching him, not forcing him to move. Just being there. I talked to him about anything and everything. I told him about my day, about the cases I had worked on, about how Sarah had almost spilled an entire bucket of water in the clinic hallway. Nothing. No response. But I kept talking. Sarah brought in a blanket and left a cup of coffee on the table beside me. "You're really going to stay?" I nodded. "As long as it takes." And so I did. The clinic closed for the night, the lights dimmed, and yet I remained by Charlie's side. His breathing was steady, but he didn't move. Not until well past midnight. I had nearly dozed off, my head resting against the kennel bars, when I felt it. A soft, warm weight pressing against my leg. I blinked, barely daring to move. Charlie had shifted, pressing his head gently against me. It was the smallest sign, but it meant everything. I reached down, brushing my fingers lightly over his fur. "Hey, buddy," he sighed, deep and slow, and for the first time all day, I saw it. A flicker of something in his eyes. Hope. The breakthrough moment. From that night on, Charlie started to improve again. It was slow, hesitant, but every day, he showed a little more life. He started eating again, first small bites, then gradually working his way up to full meals. His tail wagged again, albeit cautiously. But the real breakthrough came a week later. It was a quiet afternoon, and Sarah and I had taken Charlie outside to the clinic's small, enclosed yard. The sun was warm, the grass cool beneath our feet. Charlie stood beside me, his body tense but alert. He had never been comfortable outside, perhaps a lingering memory from his time on the streets. I knelt beside him, giving him a reassuring pat. "You're safe here." For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the open space before him. Then, without warning, he ran. Not far. Not fast. But it was the first time he had moved on his own, without coaxing, without hesitation. Sarah gasped. "Did he just?" I grinned. "Yeah, he did." Charlie turned back toward me, his tail wagging freely. And then, something incredible happened. He barked. A single, joyous, unrestrained bark. It was the first real sound of happiness I had ever heard from him. And in that moment, I knew. Charlie had finally let go of his past. The turning point. From that day forward, everything changed. Charlie no longer hesitated when we reached out to pet him. He greeted us with eager tail wags, his body no longer hunched in fear. His eyes, once dull and lifeless, were now filled with something new. Trust. Joy. A belief that he was finally, truly safe. And that was when I realized Charlie was ready for the next step. He was ready for a home. Finding his forever. I had always known that Charlie wouldn't stay with me forever. That wasn't how this worked. I was here to heal, to help, to give these animals a second chance. But as I looked at him, sitting beside me with his head resting on my knee, I felt a pang of sadness. Letting go was always the hardest part. But then, fate stepped in. One afternoon, a woman named Lisa walked into the clinic with her young son, Ethan. They had lost their family dog a year ago, and though the grief had been hard, Ethan had been asking for a new friend, a dog who needed a second chance. Charlie, ever perceptive, sensed something special about them. The moment Ethan knelt beside him, Charlie did something he had never done before. He placed his paw gently in the boy's hand. Lisa's eyes welled with tears. Sarah whispered, "I think we found his family." And just like that, I knew. Charlie wasn't just a rescue anymore. He was home. A new beginning. Watching Charlie walk out of the clinic that day, his tail wagging, his head held high, I felt an ache in my chest, but also overwhelming happiness. He had come so far. And he had found what he had always deserved. A family. As I stood at the doorway, watching them drive away, I let out a deep breath. Then, I turned back to the clinic. Because I knew, somewhere out there, another animal needed saving. And I would be ready. The day Charlie left for his new home was bittersweet. I had watched him transform from a frail, broken soul into a dog filled with life, trust, and hope. I had witnessed his first steps, his first wag, his first bark of joy. I had been with him through every setback, every struggle, and every triumph. And now, it was time to say goodbye. Lisa and her son, Ethan, arrived at the clinic early that morning, excitement shining in their eyes. They had visited Charlie a few times since our first meeting, slowly getting to know him. Ethan, in particular, had formed an instant bond with him. Charlie seemed to sense it too. The moment Ethan stepped into the room, Charlie's ears perked up. His tail started wagging, not the hesitant, unsure wag of the past, but a full, joyous thump against the floor. "He remembers you," I said, smiling. Ethan grinned and knelt down. "Hey, Charlie." Charlie didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the boy, pressing his nose into his hand, a quiet sigh of contentment escaping his body. Lisa wiped at her eyes. "I think he knows he's coming home." I nodded, swallowing the lump forming in my throat. "I think he does too." Saying goodbye. As I walked Charlie to the car, a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. The sun was shining, birds chirped in the distance, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Charlie looked completely at peace. I crouched beside him one last time, running my fingers through his now soft, golden fur. "You're going to be okay," I murmured. "You've got your family now." Charlie gazed at me, those deep brown eyes filled with something I couldn't quite describe. Gratitude? Understanding? Maybe both. Then, in a final act that sent my heart soaring, he leaned forward and licked my hand. A silent thank you. I smiled, blinking away the stinging in my eyes. "You're welcome, buddy." Ethan held onto Charlie's new leash as Lisa opened the car door. "Ready, boy?" Charlie hopped inside without hesitation. No fear. No uncertainty. Just trust. As they drove away, I stood in the parking lot, watching until the car disappeared from view. I had done my job. And Charlie? He had found his forever home. Life after rescue. Over the next few weeks, Lisa sent me updates. Charlie had settled in beautifully. He had claimed a spot on the couch as his own, spent his afternoons playing fetch in the backyard, and even started sleeping beside Ethan's bed at night. The best update came in the form of a photo. It was a simple picture, Ethan and Charlie curled up together on the sofa, the boy reading a book while Charlie rested his head on his lap, eyes half closed in sheer contentment. Attached was a message. "He's happy. Truly happy. Thank you for saving him." I stared at the photo for a long time, a slow smile spreading across my face. This was why I did what I did. This was why, despite the heartbreak, the exhaustion, and the long nights, I never stopped rescuing. Because for every story like Charlie's, for every animal saved from suffering, there was a happily ever after waiting to be written. And knowing that? That made it all worth it.